But the biggest cardinal sin is to start backwards and think about the visual layer or the look and feel or the artifacts or all those different assets, and photos and pictures and mock-ups, and then try to come up with a case study. That's a backwards approach. Do better. Be a better UX designer. Hey, what is up? Welcome back, Design Squad, and in this video I'm going to answer another question, and it has to do with UX portfolios and the depth of the actual artifacts. You could basically spend pages defining the story, outlining every single action and showcasing every single artifact and asset in the project, but is that good enough? And also she asked if she could use, let's say, the collapsible components or accordion based type of layout. But to me this is the key issue, because it's almost approaching it backwards. When you make a case study, don't think about how you're gonna present the information. That doesn't really matter. The presentation layer and what sort of assets and artifacts you use and how deep you go only is dependent on the story itself. Imagine that you come up with the best case study in the world and it has the best proportions and ratio of the text and imagery and tells the amazing story and just guides the user, your target user of a portfolio, who could be, let's say, hiring manager or a recruiter, which I covered in other videos, and their needs and challenges and things of that nature, which you need to consider. But imagine that it does all of that great. You would then get a callback because you were that amazing of a candidate to come in and talk further. And what's for sure is that in the interview, you're gonna still need to present your portfolio and a case study or several which you're most proud of. And guess what's gonna happen then? People who assessed your portfolio already are gonna want that depth. They're gonna want to know the nitty-gritty, the in-between, the interpersonal things, the challenges, the things which you didn't cover in your portfolio. And that's a key distinction, because if you would just outline everything, then what would you talk about during the interview? What happens really, usually people don't tell enough in their portfolio or tell it disjointedly so that it makes someone who reviews your portfolio, like myself, let's say, as a hiring manager, sweat basically and just use our brain for things which we shouldn't be. You should guide us through the story, and the story is the most important bit. And so don't think about the depth, don't think about how much material you can pack in and try to kind of maximize the space of accordions or try to bunch it in. Do the story first. And to give you more tangible advice of how to tell the story best and just push away those artifacts and assets for now at least, I'm gonna use a chapter from my upcoming book of Getting into UX Design, where I give specific ways to craft the story from like a framework perspective that you can follow and just kind of develop it, but also 3 specific key activities of what you should be doing so that your story is sound first and foremost. And then if it is, you can add those assets back in and kind of like make up your case study. But first and foremost, it's all about the storytelling. Every story arc has usually 3 different components, which is basically the introduction, the development, the climax, and then some sort of resolution. There's of course a lot of different interchangeable bits here and there, but I might just make another video on actual story and how to tell effective stories. But ultimately it's that. It's just basically 3 acts to every story. Now, what you need to do as a designer is really to scale it up. For example, what I start doing as a UXer when I make a case study, I think about my friend who I haven't met in a while. For whatever reason, for let's say a few months ago, we just didn't meet. And then when we meet, maybe they are gonna ask me, what's the latest project you worked on, for example. And then you could just give them the elevator pitch, for example, just a couple of minutes of, outline of why that thing is exciting. What did you go through? What was the outcome? Things of that nature, like a very bare bones. And if a friend asks for questions or want to find out more, then you give them a bigger story. You fill in the gaps, you add anecdotes, you add other bits. So that's the second activity. And the third activity, once you have that outline, that's when you would port it into a case study and add a bit more context to support the different bits. These are 3 activities. One is to come up with a very simple elevator pitch, just an outline. Maybe it's a couple of paragraphs outlining exactly what the project is about, then scale it up, adding a bit more detail, and lastly trying to put it into that story arc, which basically gonna form your case study. It is that simple. You just need to start doing, you just need to practice it, and you need to start adding up detail as you go, but also reflecting back if that still makes sense. So for example, what I would do typically when I come up with my case studies, I just give it to review to someone who's impartial, someone who can give you honest advice and just tell you that doesn't make sense, or can you kind of clarify some other bits. Ask for what doesn't make sense specifically. So you kind of user test your case studies, you're user testing your brief, and that you can do with people in your household if they're honest enough, that you can do with acquaintances, you can do with more senior designers, you can do with a lot of different people, but it's ultimately coming up with a brief, a draft, user testing, building it out as you go. And alternatively, you can always email people that stuff. So for example, your elevator pitch is very easy to validate. Your bigger story, like that second stage, you can just email to a person and say, this is what I'm working on, does that make sense? They're obviously going to ask questions. Don't just send already made case study. That's almost too late to validate. You can and you should do that way in advance. But the biggest cardinal sin is to start backwards and think about the visual layer or the look and feel or the artifacts or all those different assets, and photos and pictures and mock-ups, and then try to come up with a case study. That's a backwards approach. Do better. Be a better UX designer, meaning start from the very start, outline, draft, case study draft, and then put in the details as needed. And the actual depth in the end of how much material you need to add to support each case study or each statement or each paragraph or each chapter, whatever you choose to do, is going to depend on a project. So for example, if it's a research project, well, it's probably going to be quite deep, but you're also going to want to extract the key points. So that's why I always steer away from just having a cookie cutter approach, a template which you just fill into whatever materials you have, and then each case study looks the same, even if the scope, the depth of the actual project, the complexity varied. Showcase that complexity. The more complex case studies are gonna need much more depth. They might just need you to have like a surface level summary, but then the deeper details should showcase that complexity, and that's where you can add depth, and then if appropriate, use those accordions, whatever. But don't start with the actual material. Start with telling a compelling story which would engage the user, which would take them from introduction to the challenging bits to the kind of like a climax once you actually user test it, and then arriving at some conclusions like learnings, like updates to the designs, arriving at maybe launching the product, and what you learn from is proper case study which is engaging and appealing and kind of consumes you. It hooks you up as a hiring manager, and that's what I'm looking for as a hiring manager. I need that, and if you can make that happen, you're gonna be way more ahead than any other applicant. And also, if this resonates with you, stay tuned for a book, because the book has a bit more detail of how actually to do that. If you like this video, give a like, sub to this channel if you haven't done so, because that supports it. Also, don't forget to check other videos, because I always leave them floating down around somewhere here. If you find something interesting, make sure to watch it, leave a comment down below what you think about it, and on that note, I'll see you next time.